Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the author series on the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Deena Lindstedt. Deena is the author of the historical novel, Lady of the Play. As an author and researcher, Deena is especially passionate about historic Elizabethan England and the Shakespeare authorship question. Deena, it's a pleasure to have you join us on the Success Insight podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. And what I love about the work that you're doing is I had the good fortune to live in England for a little while. I don't remember if I got to Stratford. I do remember his old theater that was rebuilt on the Thames. But this whole idea around Shakespeare and Elizabethan England, it brings back warm memories for me. And I imagine they're very near and dear to your heart. So tell us a little bit first of your background and how you came to be interested in Elizabethan England, Shakespeare, and then came to write this book, Lady of the Play.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Actually, my background is started off, I married shortly after high school and was a mother, stay-at-home mom, and have 3 sons. And when my oldest son was ready to start to college, I thought, I better go back to work. And I have an office background. My training, I went to business college and learned to be a stenographer back in the 50s. That's what women did. You either were a nurse or you were a teacher, but some of us went to business school, and that's what I did. But I went, when I was 38, I started working full-time in an insurance industry, and I started doing workers' compensation claims. I did that for 25 years.
Wow.
And it ended up with Weyerhaeuser Company, which is a lumber producing company and headquartered out of Tacoma, Washington. And I was hired to handle their workers' compensation program, which you can imagine there were a lot of workers' comp claims within that industry.
Sure.
And I took early retirement. I'd always wanted to be a writer. It was always in the back of my mind. And so when I think I was about your age, Howard, about 61, when I decided
Thanks for telling everybody that, by the way, Deena.
Sorry about
that. Thanks a lot.
And so I started, and then by then I had met my second husband and we got married but he supported me in my writing ambition, but I never felt like I really was very good at it. And so I thought I better go back to college. So I enrolled full-time as a student at Marylhurst University in Portland and ended up graduating when I turned 70.
Wow.
And majored in English Lit and writing. And I managed to publish my first book in 2010. But what really interested me was the Shakespeare class. And I was so fascinated with the culture of Elizabethan England, and especially the way women were considered second-class citizens, actually. They weren't allowed to go to school. They were treated, marriages were designed for girls and they had to get married because that was, if they didn't get married, then they ended up maybe being servants or whatever. But yet the Shakespeare plays, if you've ever read very many of them, they have very, very strong female characters. And I thought to myself, there's got to be a woman involved in creating these plays. I mean, the culture of the time didn't make sense to me that a woman hadn't had her hand in writing them, but she would never be allowed to admit that she was a writer. And when I discussed that with my professor, she said, Deena, you really shouldn't even, it's nice of you to think that, but there's no way you could ever prove it. She said, women were never allowed to go to school. And so how in the world could you find a woman? And there's very little written about women 400 years ago. So how could you possibly find a woman to fit the role? And I said, well, I'd like to write my senior paper just on the theory that it's a woman. she says, well, okay, go ahead. Well, I did a lot of research then. And the more I researched, the more excited I got. There's got to be a woman. And then I started looking at the first clue that I found that there could be a woman was the fact that Shakespeare retired in the year 1612. And I looked at Edward deVere, who happened to be the leading candidate to be the other Shakespeare, the true Shakespeare, I should say. And his wife died in 1612, the very same year that Shakespeare retired.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, well, if there was a woman, she would have had to use a man for a front. And it made perfect sense because Elizabeth Trentham, Edward deVere's second wife, died in 1612, the very same year that Shakespeare retired. He went back to Stratford and he lived until 1616. So why in the world didn't he write some plays between the years 1612 and 1616? And he didn't.
Wow. Just a couple questions. And there's so much to talk about here.
Yeah.
And how old was William Shakespeare when he died in 1616?
Well, he was born in 1564. So let's do the math.
64. So
He'd have been
30,
50 something or
50 something. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's decent size, decent
Well,
age.
the life expectancy then was right around 40 to 50, something like
Right.
that.
So he at some point decides, so I'm going to go back to Stratford and spend the rest of my day. So definitely some interesting connection here. And something that dawns on me, and again, some of this is just based on conversations, articles I've read, but I it seemed to always remember there was a discussion that William Shakespeare could not have written these plays. And was that an area of study that you were aware of, and maybe as you were doing your research, you kind of went down that road a little bit to see what was there?
Actually, I went down that road a lot because
Okay.
there's a lot of very famous people that believe that Shakespeare could not have been the true playwright.
Okay.
People like Mark Twain, William Freud, Walt Whitman, even Orson Welles. A lot of really very learned people said not possible. And the reason why is because he lacked the education. Education was not mandatory back then.
Right.
Going to church was, they had to go to church, but they didn't have to go to school. And the only boys could go to school. And it was something that I found too, that Queen Elizabeth had put together a scholarship for anybody that was extremely bright, that they would go to Cambridge or Oxford for free. And yet Shakespeare, to be the playwright, would have to be a genius. Now, why wasn't he recognized to go to college?
Sure.
And where other playwrights were. And in fact, he lacked the education, and the only living handwritten document written by Shakespeare are 6 signatures. And you can see those 6 signatures online. And if you look at his handwriting, he doesn't even spell his name the same in those 6. And his handwriting is very, very weird. I mean, it looks like somebody's just trying to learn how to write cursive.
Okay.
And so you think, how could he possibly be? And also, to be Shakespeare, you had to have traveled to Europe, and there's no evidence that Shakespeare ever did that. And many other reasons why his parents and his wife and his children were all illiterate. And so he just didn't have the background to be Shakespeare.
So no background, no education.
Very little education.
Very little education, very little evidence of his writing that can be attributed to him. You just said like 6 signatures and all varying levels of legibility, so to speak.
Right.
But so when was the first play produced? I mean, I don't know if that's a leading question. I'm sure this.
Well, I don't know that there's any definite date. There's a lot of different controversy about when It was the very first play they figured was King Henry VI. And you have to look at the history of England to know that when that first play was produced, England was at war with Spain. The Spanish Armada was in 1588. And I figured that Queen Elizabeth would have needed to raise the taxes. The taxes had to be raised to support the war with Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And she needed some propaganda. And what better place to have it than on the stage? And so King Henry VI was during the time of Joan of Arc. Remember, King Henry V captured several French cities, but his son, King Henry VI, actually lost those cities because of Joan of Arc.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing I figured out was, wouldn't it make sense if Queen Elizabeth needed to have her population support her with this war? And being a woman, I'm sure the courtiers wanted to probably replace her with a man because a man would be more adept to fighting this war.
Sure.
But she needed to prove that she was capable. And so if you ever saw the portraits of Joan of Arc, she had on an armor and she's holding a banner in front of the army. And well, what does Queen Elizabeth do? She has an armor made for herself, and she shows up at Tilbury and gives a speech to the Army and Navy that are ready to fight the Spanish Armada. So I think in her way, because of the play, I think the plays fit right in that, because you have to understand that everybody went to the plays. The elite or the gentry, they would sit in the bleachers type of like at the Globe Theater. It's
Mm-hmm.
an open air theater, and they would sit where they could sit down, but the population would go into the ground, and for a penny, they could stand there. They're called groundlings, and they could watch the plays. So these plays were very, very popular.
Okay.
And so I think really Queen Elizabeth must have had that first play produced
Okay.
for propaganda purposes.
Okay. When did you become aware of what Edward deVere, when you were doing your research and when he began to show up in some writing, and when this perception that, wait a minute, there's some question about the authorship, but then here's this very educated and he has a titled individual. When did you become aware of him in this research?
Well, it was actually during the class, and our professor had a debate team, and she had part of it argue the fact that it had to have been William Shakespeare, the playwright. The other side said it had to be Edward deVere. And the reason why Edward deVere was considered the leading candidate is based on a man by the name of Looney, his name John Thomas Looney. And he lived between 1870 and 1944, and he was an English school teacher. And he was the one that really did the research to come up with Edward deVere. And Edward deVere fits the role necessary to be Shakespeare perfectly.
Okay.
He was educated at Cambridge. He owned his own troupe of players. He had the Oxford Boys and the Oxford Men. He was also the Queen's Lord Chamberlain, so he's very powerful in the court. He traveled throughout the British Isles, and also he went abroad at least twice, we know of. He was also fluent in Latin and Greek, and he had other languages as well. And he was also known to write poetry.
Okay.
So he fit the role of Shakespeare perfectly.
Okay.
Especially so many of the plays take place in, Hamlet in Denmark and Italy especially. So many of the plays are there. And he traveled extensively.
Okay. And his second wife, Elizabeth Trentham, how much did you learn about her in terms of just being a part of the ruling class, and how did she come to your awareness?
Well, it was mainly through the life of Edward deVere. And
Okay.
there's some pretty famous professors that have written books about Edward deVere. In fact, they even made a movie a few years back, not a very good movie, but it was called Anonymous. It was about Edward deVere.
Ah,
And so I think it's pretty common acceptance that he's probably was Shakespeare, but there's a big problem with him in that he died too soon.
right.
He died in 1604, where new plays were still being written up until 1612, the same year his wife died.
Okay.
So if they were in collaboration, it makes perfect sense that she would continue to write plays after his death. So
Yeah.
that's my contention.
Yeah, it's interesting that even after his death, she would still write plays and it would
Having,
still be accepted.
yeah, well, except she had to write it through a front, which
Right.
was
William
Shakespeare.
Shakespeare.
Right.
I love
And
this.
and
I-
she's an interesting woman too. And
Yeah.
a strange coincidence happened to me when I was doing my research. I was asked my senior paper, my professor liked it so much that she recommended me to give it at the Shakespeare Symposium, which happened to take place here in Portland at Concordia, the college. And the professor there his name was Daniel Wright, and she knew him, and she said, I've got this student here that's written this paper about Shakespeare being a woman. She might be interesting to ask to be in the symposium. So I got on as a guest, and while I was there, I got some compliments from my paper, and there were several people that I networked with, and one of them came up to me and she said, you're talking about Elizabeth Trentham maybe helping Edward deVere. And I said, yeah. And she says, are you aware that Elizabeth Trentham's will has been uncovered and it's in the British archives?
Oh,
I said,
wow.
no. And she said, well, in her will, she leaves money to her dumb man.
That's the quote which I didn't have right when you and I first started the call. That's what somewhere, and I forget where it was on your website or in the book as I was going through it. I just thought that was pretty interesting.
Well, it's true. And in fact, I was so excited about it. I called up my professor and I said, Meg, I said, guess what? I think I found the true Shakespeare. And she said, Deena, taking me down. I said, but she left in her will money to her dumb man. And she says, well, Deena, do you know what dumb meant back in the 1500s? And so I said, well, not really. So I went into a website and I started saying, did Shakespeare use the word dumb? And I found a place where Shakespeare actually said, it's a Gracinio. I must be a dumb man, for I'm never allowed to speak. So therefore I thought, dumb means you're not allowed, you can't speak. You're dumb. So
interesting.
So I thought, okay, well, we got the right time. So that was my first clue, the fact that she died in 1612, the same year he retired. And then I have this will.
Okay.
So I took it from there. I thought, well, I think this woman would make a great protagonist for a novel.
I love it. And one question, and then I want to get into the book.
Okay.
The will, have you had an opportunity? Is it available to you in some shape or fashion?
Well, it's available to everybody. It's on the internet.
Okay. So
it wasn't at the time when I first started doing my research.
Right.
And this woman that I was talking to, and I wish I could remember her name, but at any rate, she said she was actually involved in transcribing it, even because in the old English you needed some transcription. So I actually had the copy of the original as well as her translation. So
okay.
But anybody can see it if they went online.
Now, did you learn more about this woman as a result of reading the will, or was that really just that was the goal right there?
That helped me a lot, but I did a great deal of research, reading every book I could find. I kind of went to a lot of different libraries. The big library in Portland is downtown, and I spent a lot of time up there just looking through the library books. And one of the funny things I found too was the translation of the King James Version of the Bible took place during Shakespeare's time.
Right.
King James brought together 47 translators in 1604, which happens to be the very same year that Edward deVere died. And they published the Bible in 1611. And it was really the best thing he could have done, because what it did, it put people, the common person, able to read the Bible and in English. And what I've discovered that in Psalms 46, if you look at the, and you can pull up Psalms 46 on the internet.
Sure.
But if you start counting the 46th Psalm, and if you start counting the words from the beginning, you get down to the 46th word, and it says shake. You start counting 46 words from the bottom of the Psalms, and it says spear, Shakespeare. So we think that's where the name Shakespeare originated from. And she was leaving. He couldn't have been Edward deVere because he was dead.
Right.
So it was her. And so it wasn't until I almost finished my book, and I was just actually coming up with the theory that it could have been her. But when I found this, I thought, it's gotta be her.
That's the smoking gun, so to speak, that little
exactly
metaphor.
And I hate to kind of tell everybody what I found, because they could actually, if they read the 46th Psalm, and then they go in and they look at Edward deVere's the crest,
right,
and it's a lion, and you can find this on the internet too. It's actually a lion, and it's holding a spear, and it's a broken spear, but at the very tip of the spear is like the nib of a pin.
Right.
Okay. And so a lot of say that had to have been Edward deVere's Shakespeare because of this crest and the broken spear. And in a lot of the scholars and so forth said that the broken spear has to do with the spear shaker, something in Greek. But actually, if you look down on the 46th Psalm at the 9th verse, you'll see where the spear has been cut. The cutteth the spear. This is God talking about cutting the spear or ending war, so to speak. And so if you look at that crest and you see that broken spear, which is really into my feeling, it's exactly from the Psalm.
Okay.
So there's a direct correlation between the King James Version of the Bible and the 46th Psalm and that deVere crest.
Wow. You're like Ms. Columbo here. I love this.
That's what was so fun about this, is because I felt like a detective. And when I discovered this, I was so excited. I called my son, and I said, he lives close by, and I said, you can't believe what I found. And he said, Mom, you might have solved a 400-year mystery. I said, well, that's it. That is exciting. So
yeah, well, good for you. So let's chat about the book. I mean, believe it or not, Dean, I said this is going to be a 20 to 30 minute podcast. We're already in the 25th minute. So we're on a roll here. So I'm not going to cut you short of 30 minutes. Trust me on this. So let's talk about the book, Lady of the Play. How did you begin to organize this? Because I love the fact that it is a historical novel and it's a work of fiction. So tell us more about the book and its construction.
Well, it's actually, it's a modern book as well as a historical book. And I did that mainly because I wanted to show a certain comparison between modern day and what it was like 400 years ago. But I also wanted to not just show the difference, but I wanted to show a commonality as well. And I really struggled with this. At first, I thought maybe I should just write a straight historical novel. And then I thought, well, maybe I could write two books. I'll write the historical novel, then I'll write the modern one where this woman is finding all this clues about who really was Shakespeare. But then I thought, no, my writing group said, no, Deena, let's interspace them. So that's what I decided to do. It made it a little more interesting, I think, to show my protagonist, the Cynthia, the modern woman, why she wants to prove that Elizabeth Trentham is Shakespeare, along collaborating with Edward deVere. And so I thought, well, to do that, you have to make the historical person fit the profile that needs to be done to prove it's Shakespeare.
Right.
So that was what was so much fun about writing, is to kind of create using historical facts about her birth and where she grew up and all of this. So I tried to, and then also the plays. I tried to give her the experience to write the plays. So the very first historical chapter is about how Midsummer Night's Dream came about. And she's sleeping out in the field wanting to see the fairies because it's Midsummer's Eve. And so that's kind of how that came about. And so in my modern story, though, I have her elderly woman who lives in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And I chose Hot Springs because Weyerhaeuser sent me to Hot Springs so many times that I decided to use that city.
Good for Hot Springs.
Yeah, right. And anyhow,
we got to get you into speaking engagements in Hot Springs, by the way. So you work with Linda on that. By the way, to our listeners, Linda is Linda O'Connor Communication. This is Deena's publicist. So yeah, get Linda to work with you to get into Hot Springs.
Yeah, well, it would be fun to go back to Hot Springs, that's for sure. But she finds an original, and one other thing people might not be aware of, there are no original documents. Nobody has ever found any original handwritten plays.
Yeah.
They disappeared. The folio was printed. Actually, it's almost anniversary next year. It was 1623, the first folio. But after that printing was done and made the plays public, the original documents vanished.
That's odd.
And I thought to myself, if there's really a woman involved, and the queen would not want, she was a maid of honor to the queen for 10 years.
Right.
So she had all that experience, and how she met Edward deVere. But it would not be accepted for a woman to be accepted doing that kind of work, especially someone that was in the queen's court.
Right. So there's this older woman, and she reaches out to your protagonist.
Right. And she does. Because and I took from my own experience, this paper I wrote when I was a senior was called Shakespeare Woman. Mm-hmm. And the woman happens to go to the same college as the Cynthia did. And she reaches out to her because it's been published in the college paper.
Right.
And so she reaches out to her and has her come to Hot Springs. And then she sees the original page from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And the page had fallen out of a book of prayers that had been passed down through the generations. And my gal in Hot Springs is an elderly woman in her 80s, and her name is Sudie. And Sudie is bound and determined. She doesn't want to make the page public because she wants to prove her ancestor was the true Shakespeare.
So this book of prayer was actually a book of the Psalms, and that's where
it was the book. In England, after the King Henry VIII formed the Protestant church, so to speak, or the Church of England.
Okay.
The book of prayers was produced.
Okay.
And so everybody had the book of prayers that had to go to church and had to have this book of prayers. So this book of prayers was passed down through the generations in her family. So that's how, and this page was sandwiched in the cover, the leather cover, and because of the age of it, and the page fell out.
Okay.
But I have a ghost in my book. I mean, like Hamlet's ghost. I had to have a ghost. And so this ghost is the one that comes to Sudie in a dream and tells her where to look for this book of prayers. And she finds the page.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
So I started off the book starts off that way.
Okay. How long did it take you to write the book?
Can you believe 10 years?
Okay.
I started writing it right after I finished with that little speech. It was actually in 2011 is when I gave that speech. And the first thing I did, one of my granddaughters had just graduated from college too. We kind of graduated about the same time. So I said, I really want to take a trip to England. And so Elizabeth, and her name's Elizabeth too, she and I went to England and we had quite an adventure. And I wanted to go to Stratfordshire, which is where Elizabeth Trentham lived as a
Sure.
child and so forth. And all of these strange coincidences happened. And anyway, we were going, when we ended up in Stratford, we were driving, which was quite an experience. Have you ever
Oh, yeah.
driven in England? It's just, and I rented a bigger car, which was a mistake because those roads are so narrow.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And they're, and I know my granddaughter, and you're on the opposite side, you're steering from the right side.
Right.
So I kept feeling I was too close to the line in the middle. But my granddaughter says, "Grandma, you're going to run into all these bushes." She was constantly screaming at me. But anyway, we went to Stratfordshire, and it was on a weekday, and the church there, St. Michael's, which had been so much history. It had been around since the Romans. And at any rate, I wanted to go into the church, but it was all locked up. But we started looking through the graveyard, I think, trying to find a tombstone that dated back. Maybe I could find the Trentham family or something. And at any rate, this woman was walking into the church with flowers. And so we talked to each other a little bit. She says, "Would you like to look around the church?" I said, "Oh, I'd love to." And so we went in and she took us on a tour. And she told us all about the church, that this was the original place where the first church, this was the third church in existence then. But we went, she said, I talked to her about the abbey. There was an abbey there where the monks, and then when they deserted it, Thomas Trentham, Elizabeth's father, inherited that. And that's where they lived. And that there was a picture in the church, a painting somebody had made of the abbey and the tower there. So I was able to include all of that information in my book. And thanks to her name was Wendy Ellis, and it was so wonderful. But these little strange coincidences kept happening to me all through the writing of this book.
That's fantastic.
It was almost eerie, actually.
It's like you had your own personal ghost help
I
guiding you.
know. I really honestly felt like it, that, oh dear, after I'm gone, maybe I'll find Elizabeth Trentham and say, well, how close did I come to mapping out your life?
Sure, sure. So what has been the reaction to the book?
A lot of skepticism.
Mhm.
A lot of skepticism. It's been hard to convince people to believe that I think there's either so tied into Shakespeare being the author, or or Edward deVere, they don't want to admit that anybody helped him at all. But I would think would be just common sense
Yeah.
to think that there had to have been a woman involved. I mean,
Right.
why would you put all these strong women in? Portia in The Merchant of Venice. I mean, she dressed up as a man and an attorney, and Taming of the Shrew, Kate was pretty feisty. And then there's Lady Macbeth. There's so many such great women in the characters. And
Yeah, all strong women, and almost all the plays, or many of the plays. That way.
yeah,
It's not almost all. It's less than
yeah,
almost all. Many of the plays had these miscommunications between characters who were
yeah,
women who had to dress up as men to accomplish something,
right.
and
Well, I had to include that in my book, you see,
yeah,
because Elizabeth dresses up like a boy to escape getting married to this guy that she just couldn't do, was detestable.
right.
So she cut her hair, she dresses up like a man, and then she runs away.
That
And
sounds like Arya Stark from the Game of Thrones.
really, haven't
Well,
seen that one.
Ah, well, I think it's just for one thing, congratulations. I mean, you set out to pursue after a career to pursue something you were deeply interested in, which was writing, and you went back to school and you set out, you came up with these theories, you pursued the research, You wrote the book, and frankly, to heck with what anybody says. You just accomplished something that some people, they're never even going to accomplish. You wrote a book.
Yeah.
So congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate being able to show my side of the story, Howard.
Yeah. And what I love about it too is that you can be a part of a whole group of people who are passionate about these works of art, whether it is the Edward deVere or Elizabeth Trentham, Shakespeare, but there's a whole community of people who are passionate about this work. And now you are a part of that community. And I think even pursuing this trip with your granddaughter to England, which to me must have been fun, because you never know when those chance encounters are going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. It was, we still laugh about it. It was a pretty funny trip.
Just stay off the road.
But I'll never do that again.
Oh, yeah. I busted a tire the very first time I had my car in England, but then after that, I was fine. So, Deena, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work and about this wonderful book, The Lady of the Play, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, go to my website, DeenaLindstedt.com. And actually the book is for sale for several different places, Amazon and Barnes and Noble, wherever you want to. And with the help of Linda, we're trying to get the libraries to order it as well.
Sounds good. Sounds good. And really just a phenomenal journey. And I know you're on Facebook and on Instagram as well. And
LinkedIn.
And on LinkedIn. Fantastic. And we'll provide the backlinks to your social sites as well as to your website. And of course, we'll provide some backlinks to the book sites like Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And I am excited to continue through the book. And it's one of those, you kind of work all day coaching clients, doing podcasts, and it's like, well, I usually have about 3 to 4 pages in me, and then and then I'm like, I'm ready for bed. So it takes me a long time to read a book. But I want to thank you for taking the time to join us on the author series on the Success Insight podcast.
Well, thank you, Howard. It's been a pleasure.
Very good. And we wish you nothing but good fortune and, happiness and accolades through writing the book. You've accomplished a lot, and we appreciate it. So,
okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, listen, stay on the line. We're going to do a quick close and you and I can have a final chat. Okay.
Sounds good.
Very good. All right, folks. We have just been learning a little bit about Elizabethan England, Shakespeare, and Deena and her background in the insurance industry and entire career. And then she went off and went back to college and pursued her interest in writing and really this interest in Elizabethan England and Shakespeare, and really this idea of who was the real author of these plays, that knowing William Shakespeare. But now we have Edward deVere, Elizabeth Trentham, who, according to Deena, bears some looking into of who were the true authors of these works of art. But in any case, you've got a great book with a lot of history, some fiction, and really an opportunity to kind of delve back into an area of writing, Elizabethan England, again, Shakespeare, art, a little mystery. We've got some ghosts along the way. And what a great way to spend some time on whether it's a cold winter day or you want to take it to the beach, wherever you are, you got a great work of art to read. Now, you can find more about Deena and her work on our website, DeenaLindstedt.com. We're also going to provide a link back to her Facebook page and Instagram and on LinkedIn as well. Folks, do check Deena's work out and any one of these sources. Also, let us know your thoughts on today's podcast on the author series on Success Insight Podcast. You can find us on Facebook and on LinkedIn at Success Insight Podcast. And we are on almost all, if not all, of the major podcasting platforms: Amazon Music, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Audible, Spotify, etc. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day. And we will see you on a future episode of the author series on the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.